Picture this: an organization that has spent over a century declaring itself the sole channel of divine truth, suddenly starts reversing policies it once called unchangeable. Not minor adjustments. Not subtle refinements. Complete reversals of doctrines that destroyed families, ruined careers, and shaped entire generations. And here's the thing that should terrify every current member and validate every ex-member watching this. When an institution famous for never admitting mistakes starts changing everything, it's not because they found new light. It's because they're terrified of what's coming. In the last few years, something extraordinary has been happening inside the Watchtower organization. Changes have been announced quietly, almost bureaucratically, dressed up in the familiar language of progressive understanding and loving adjustments from Jehovah. But when you strip away the religious packaging and look at the actual pattern, what you see is an organization in full crisis mode. These aren't updates. They're damage control. They're not reforms. They're desperate attempts to stop the bleeding before the whole system collapses. And if you're watching this video, you already know something's wrong. Maybe you're still in and you've noticed the cognitive dissonance between what they said 10 years ago and what they're saying now. Maybe you've already left and you're watching the organization scramble to fix problems you were punished for pointing out. Or maybe you're just curious about how high-control groups operate when they start losing control. Whoever you are, what I'm about to show you is the anatomy of an organization trying to survive the one enemy it never prepared for, reality itself. Before we dive deep into this investigation, if you're finding value in content that pulls back the curtain on religious manipulation and institutional deception, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel exists to document, analyze, and expose the mechanisms of control that these organizations use, and every subscription helps us reach more people who need to hear the truth. And if you've lived through any of what we're about to discuss, drop a comment below. Your story matters. Your experience validates others. Let's build a community where the truth actually does set people free. Now, let's examine exactly what's happening inside the Watchtower, why it's happening, and what it reveals about the future of this organization. 1. The end of our reporting, and what it was really hiding. When the Watchtower announced in 2023 that publishers would no longer be required to report their field service hours, the official explanation was carefully crafted spiritual language about focusing on quality over quantity, about making the ministry more personal and less mechanical. They dressed it up as liberation, as a loving provision from Jehovah to remove unnecessary burdens. But anyone who lived inside that system knows exactly what those hour reports really were. A surveillance mechanism, a performance metric, a social currency that determined your entire worth in the congregation. For decades, those monthly slips of paper controlled everything. They determined whether you were considered spiritually strong or spiritually weak. They influenced whether you could get married to that person you loved, because their family would check your hours before approving the relationship. They decided whether you'd ever be appointed as a ministerial servant or elder. They were whispered about in backrooms when pioneers gossiped about who was falling behind. They were weaponized by overzealous elders to justify invasive questioning about your personal life. And for the organization itself, they were the primary statistical measure of growth, engagement, and organizational health. So what happened? Why would they suddenly eliminate the very metric they'd built their entire outreach program around? The answer is brutally simple. The numbers were collapsing, and keeping the reporting system meant admitting the collapse on paper, in official statistics that would be published for the whole world to see. Think about it logically. If the hours were going up, if engagement was thriving, if the ministry was experiencing unprecedented growth, would they eliminate the tracking system? Of course not. They'd celebrate those numbers. They'd publish them proudly. They'd use them as evidence of Jehovah's blessing. But that's not what was happening. What was happening was a catastrophic decline in field service participation. Publishers were burning out. The door-to-door work that once seemed urgent now felt pointless. The cart witnessing that was supposed to revolutionize preaching turned into lonely hours standing next to literature that nobody wanted. And the pandemic lockdowns gave millions of Jehovah's Witnesses a taste of what life felt like without the constant pressure of meeting quotas, and many of them realized they didn't want to go back. The Watchtower faced a choice: continue publishing declining numbers that would demoralize the membership and provide ammunition for critics, or eliminate the metric entirely and claim it was a spiritual improvement. They chose the latter. But make no mistake, this wasn't done to free the publishers. It was done to hide a hemorrhage. It's the equivalent of a company stopping quarterly earnings reports right when they're about to show massive losses. You don't eliminate your measurement system when things are going well. You eliminate it when you can't afford to let anyone see how bad things actually are. And here's the really insidious part. By framing this as a loving provision, they turned a symptom of organizational decline into a test of loyalty. Now, if you point out that this change reveals declining engagement, you're accused of being negative, of not appreciating Jehovah's generosity, of being apostate in your thinking. They've weaponized the change itself to silence the very criticism it should generate. That's not transparency. That's not reform. That's manipulation at its finest. 2. The sudden permission for university, after destroying generations. For those who weren't raised as Jehovah's Witnesses, it might be hard to grasp just how deeply the anti-education doctrine ran through this organization. This wasn't a casual discouragement. This was systematic, institutional suppression of higher education that ruined countless lives. Young people with dreams of becoming doctors, engineers, teachers, or scientists were pulled aside by elders and told that pursuing university was a sign of spiritual weakness, of misplaced priorities, of putting Satan's world ahead of kingdom interests. I've read letters from parents who were counseled to prevent their children from accepting scholarships. I've heard testimonies from people who turned down full academic rides because the congregation convinced them it would displease Jehovah. These weren't isolated incidents. This was organizational policy, repeated from platforms, published in literature, enforced through social pressure and marketing talks. And the consequences were devastating. Entire generations of Jehovah's Witnesses were locked into low-wage jobs, unable to support families, dependent on government assistance, trapped in economic insecurity, all because they were told that seeking education showed lack of faith in the imminent arrival of Armageddon. And what happened to those who defied the counsel? They were marked. They lost privileges. They were excluded from social gatherings. Young men who went to university found they would never be appointed as ministerial servants, let alone elders. Young women who pursued careers were considered bad association, materialistic, not suitable for marriage to spiritual brothers. The social punishment was severe, deliberate, and effective at enforcing compliance. Now, suddenly, in 2024, it's a personal decision. No apology. No acknowledgement of the damage. No explanation for why what was spiritually dangerous 5 years ago is now a matter of personal choice. Just a quiet policy shift buried in a Watchtower article, phrased in careful language that allows them to claim they never forbade it while anyone who lived through it knows that's a lie. So why the change? Because they're losing young people at an unprecedented rate. The generation that grew up with internet access, with exposure to critical thinking, with the ability to see what life looks like outside the organization, they're leaving in droves. And the ones who stay are increasingly vocal about not wanting to spend their lives in financial struggle while the organization builds multi-million-dollar media centers and real estate empires. The Watchtower realized that if they didn't ease up on the education restrictions, they would lose an entire generation, and losing a generation means losing the future. This change isn't benevolence. It's damage control. It's a desperate attempt to stop the exodus by giving young people just enough permission to pursue education that they might stay in the organization while doing it. But here's the catch. They still haven't admitted they were wrong. They haven't apologized to the people whose lives they destroyed with the previous policy. They haven't offered to compensate the now middle-aged members who are stuck in poverty because they followed organizational counsel. And the most cynical part? They'll probably succeed in convincing the current generation that this was always their position, that critics are lying when they say university was discouraged, that the organization always supported education in moderation. Memory holding their own history is a skill they've perfected. But for those of us who lived through it, who still carry the scars of those decisions, we know exactly what this change represents. It's not progress. It's panic. 3. From disfellowshipping to removal. The vocabulary game. One of the most revealing changes in recent years has been the quiet shift in terminology around expulsion. For over a century, the word disfellowshipping carried enormous weight in Jehovah's Witness culture. It was harsh, final, unmistakable. When someone was disfellowshipped, everyone knew exactly what it meant. Total social death, complete shunning, treatment as if the person had ceased to exist. The word itself conveyed the severity of the action, the permanence of the punishment, the devastation of the consequence. Now, increasingly, the organization is shifting to the term removal. On the surface, this might seem like a minor semantic change, just updating language to sound more modern or less harsh. But anyone who understands how high-control groups operate knows that vocabulary is never neutral. Words are weapons. Words shape perception. Words determine how policies are judged by outsiders. And the shift from disfellowshipping to removal is a calculated public relations move designed to make one of their most abusive practices sound administrative rather than punitive. Think about the connotations. Disfellowshipping sounds religious, severe, emotional. It sounds like exactly what it is, a brutal form of social punishment designed to psychologically torture someone into compliance. Removal, on the other hand, sounds bureaucratic, neutral, almost necessary. It sounds like something you'd do with a broken part in a machine, not something you'd do to a human being. It sounds temporary, procedural, maybe even protective of the congregation rather than punitive toward the individual. But here's the reality. Nothing has actually changed about the practice. People who are removed face the exact same shunning as people who were disfellowshipped. Their families still won't speak to them. Their friends still cross the street to avoid them. They're still treated as spiritually dead, dangerous, contaminated. The only thing that's changed is the marketing. The package has been redesigned, but the product inside is exactly as toxic as it always was. So why the change? Because disfellowshipping was becoming a legal liability. In court cases around the world, the term was being used by lawyers to demonstrate the extremity of Watchtower's shunning practices. Human rights organizations were citing the emotional devastation of disfellowshipping as evidence of psychological abuse. Governments were questioning whether an organization that practiced such severe shunning deserved tax exemptions and charitable status. The word itself had become a liability because it accurately conveyed how harmful the practice actually is. By shifting to removal, the Watchtower creates linguistic distance from the reality of what they're doing. When questioned by authorities or courts, they can now describe the practice in softer terms. They can claim it's simply removing someone from a membership list, a perfectly reasonable administrative action that any organization might take. They can hide the human cost behind corporate language. And most insidiously, they can claim to critics that the practice has been reformed, that they've become more moderate, that they've addressed the concerns, when literally nothing has changed except the word they use. 4. The change in Bethel age requirements and the fear of legal exposure. For decades, Bethel service was held up as the pinnacle of spiritual achievement for young Jehovah's Witnesses. The opportunity to work at world headquarters, to be part of the spiritual paradise, to contribute directly to the organization's mission, this was presented as the highest honor a young person could aspire to. And the organization actively recruited teenagers, sometimes as young as 16 or 17 in some countries, to come serve at Bethel facilities around the world. These young people would work long hours in printing facilities, binderies, maintenance departments, laundries, kitchens, and administrative offices. They received room and board, a tiny monthly allowance that barely covered basic necessities, no salary, no benefits, no retirement contributions, no worker protections. They were told this was a privilege, a blessing, a sacred service to Jehovah. They were told that the work they were doing was storing up treasures in heaven, that material compensation was unnecessary because they were part of God's organization. In reality, what was happening was exploitation. Young people, often straight out of high school, were providing labor that would cost the organization millions of dollars if they had to pay actual workers. They were doing skilled work, operating expensive machinery, maintaining complex facilities, performing professional-level graphic design and translation, all for essentially no compensation. And because they were teenagers, because they were indoctrinated into seeing this as spiritual service rather than employment, they didn't question the arrangement. But the world changed. Labor laws tightened. International scrutiny of religious organizations increased. Investigative journalists started asking uncomfortable questions about how the Watchtower could operate large-scale manufacturing and publishing operations with unpaid labor, including minors. The potential for legal exposure became enormous. Imagine the headlines if a scandal emerged involving teenage workers at Bethel facilities, working without proper compensation, without educational opportunities, essentially trapped in what critics might call religious servitude. So the organization changed the policy. Now the minimum age for Bethel service is 18 in most locations, sometimes higher. And again, this was presented as a loving provision, as making sure young people were mature enough for the commitment. But the real motivation is transparent: legal protection. 18 is the age of majority in most jurisdictions. At 18, someone legally entering a voluntary work arrangement is much harder to prosecute as exploitation than a minor in the same situation. This change wasn't about protecting young people. If it was, they would have acknowledged that maybe having 17-year-olds working full-time in factories instead of pursuing education or careers wasn't the best spiritual guidance. But there's been no such acknowledgement. Instead, it's framed as an organizational adjustment, with no admission that the previous policy was problematic. And here's what's particularly cynical. While they've adjusted the age requirement to avoid legal problems, they haven't changed the fundamental exploitation that Bethel's service represents. Those 18-year-olds are still working for barely any compensation. They're still giving years of their lives to an organization that can dismiss them at any moment with no severance, no references that translate to the outside world, no resume-building experience that helps them if they leave. The organization has simply created a legal shield while maintaining the exploitative core of the system. 5. The judicial pressures the Watchtower won't acknowledge. Over the past decade, the legal landscape for the Watchtower organization has become increasingly hostile, and for good reason. Court cases around the world have exposed systematic problems: child abuse cover-ups that left predators protected and victims silenced, document destruction that eliminated evidence of institutional wrongdoing, shunning policies that tear families apart and cause documented psychological harm, blood doctrine enforcement that has led to preventable deaths, and failure to report crimes to authorities because of misapplied religious confidentiality claims. In Australia, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse found that the Watchtower had over 1,000 cases of alleged child abuse in their records, and not a single one had been reported to police. In the United Kingdom, the Charity Commission has investigated Watchtower entities for safeguarding failures. In the United States, courts have awarded multi-million-dollar judgments against the organization for negligence in protecting abuse victims. In Norway, the government stripped Jehovah's Witnesses of state funding due to their shunning practices being deemed harmful to children and families. In Belgium, criminal investigations have examined whether the organization's practices constitute a criminal enterprise. The legal pressure is global, sustained, and intensifying. And here's what's crucial to understand: every single policy change we're discussing exists within this legal context. The organization isn't reforming because they've had a moral awakening. They're adjusting because their lawyers are telling them they have to. Each change is a calculated move to reduce liability, to present a more sympathetic image to courts and governments, to create plausible deniability about the severity of their control mechanisms. Take the abuse reporting policies as a prime example. For years, the two-witness rule meant that unless there were two witnesses to abuse, which almost never happens, the organization wouldn't take action against an accused abuser. Elders were instructed not to report abuse to police if it wasn't legally required, citing clergy confidentiality. Victims were told to pray more, to forgive, to stay silent. Abusers were quietly moved to different congregations where they had access to new victims. As lawsuits mounted and public outrage grew, the organization started making incremental changes. In some jurisdictions, they now instruct elders to report abuse regardless of the two-witness rule. But notice the language: in some jurisdictions. They're not changing the fundamental policy because it's morally wrong. They're changing it in places where it's legally necessary. In areas where mandatory reporting laws aren't as strict, the old policies often remain in place. This isn't moral progress. This is legal risk management. Or consider the shunning policy changes. The Watchtower now claims that families can decide how much contact to have with disfellowshipped relatives, that it's a personal choice based on conscience. But read the actual literature carefully and you'll see the policy hasn't actually changed. They still heavily imply that continued association is spiritually dangerous. They still publish articles praising parents who completely shun their children. They've just added enough ambiguous language to claim in court that they don't mandate shunning, that it's a voluntary personal decision, when anyone inside the organization knows the social and spiritual pressure makes it anything but voluntary. The pattern is clear: modify the official policy just enough to have legal defensibility, but maintain the cultural enforcement mechanisms so the actual practice continues largely unchanged. Create written policies that sound reasonable to courts while maintaining unwritten expectations that keep members complying with the harsher reality. It's organizational doublespeak perfected. At the deepest level, what we're witnessing is an organization confronting something it never thought it would have to face: the real possibility of decline and irrelevance. For over 100 years, the Watchtower operated on the assumption that growth was inevitable, that truth would prevail, that Jehovah's blessing would manifest in ever-increasing numbers, influence, and resources. The narrative was always forward momentum, always progress, always expansion. But the data tells a different story now. When you account for population growth, the organization isn't growing, it's contracting. In developed countries with free information access, the decline is precipitous. The age demographics show an organization getting older, with young people leaving at rates that threaten long-term viability. The financial pressures are serious enough that they've had to consolidate facilities, sell properties, and reduce operations. The legal challenges are mounting globally with no sign of abating. For the first time in its history, the Watchtower is facing the prospect that it might not survive in its current form. Not because of persecution from governments, not because of opposition from rival religions, but because of something far more devastating: people simply leaving because they figured out the truth about the organization. And that realization, that existential threat, is what's driving these changes. They're not reforming because they want to. They're reforming because they're terrified. Terrified that if they don't ease up on young people, they'll lose the next generation entirely. Terrified that if they don't address the legal problems, governments will strip their tax exemptions and charitable status. Terrified that if they don't reduce the most burdensome requirements, the exhausted membership will simply stop participating. Terrified that if they don't soften their image, the public perception will become so negative that growth becomes impossible. These changes aren't evidence of strength. They're evidence of weakness. They're not signs of confidence. They're signs of desperation. A strong organization expanding in truth doesn't need to quietly reverse decades of policy. A confident leadership doesn't need to rebrand its harshest practices with softer terminology. A system that's actually blessed by divine favor doesn't need to constantly adjust its approach to stem the tide of people walking away. What we're seeing is the beginning of the end of an era. Not necessarily the end of the organization. It may limp along for decades, but the end of its golden age of unchallenged control and assumed inevitability. The Watchtower of 2025 is not the confident, expanding organization it was in 1975 or even in 2000. It's a defensive organization in damage control mode, trying to survive in a world that has become far more hostile to high-control religious movements. And here's the cruel irony for current members: the organization is changing precisely because the critics were right. Every policy they're softening now is something ex-members and outside observers have been saying was harmful for years. The education policy was destructive, that's why they changed it. The hour reporting was damaging, that's why they eliminated it. The shunning terminology was too harsh, that's why they rebranded it. The Bethel age requirement was legally risky, that's why they adjusted it. But instead of admitting that the critics had valid points, instead of acknowledging that maybe the apostates were actually trying to help current members by exposing these problems, the organization frames each change as new light, as progressive understanding, as loving provisions. They get credit for fixing problems they should never have created in the first place, while the people who pointed out those problems years ago are still branded as enemies. The Jehovah's Witnesses organization can change terminology, adjust policies, soften rhetoric, and eliminate requirements. They can rebrand their harshest practices with gentler language. They can selectively reform the aspects that generate the most criticism while leaving the core control structure intact. They can present each change as evidence of humble willingness to improve, as proof of divine guidance leading to better understanding. But none of these reforms alter what sits at the absolute center of the organization: the need for total control. The insistence that this, and only this, is God's organization. The demand for unquestioning obedience to human leaders. The enforcement of loyalty through fear of losing family and community. The extraction of free labor and financial resources from members who are promised spiritual rewards that never quite materialize. The protection of institutional reputation over the safety and well-being of individual members. And when a system built entirely on control starts pretending it's becoming more flexible, you have to ask why. The answer is never that they've had a genuine change of heart. The answer is always fear. fear of legal consequences, fear of member exodus, fear of public exposure, fear of financial collapse, fear of generational decline, fear that the house of cards might finally fall. The changes we're witnessing right now, in 2025, don't point toward a future of greater freedom within the organization. They point toward an institution desperately trying to prevent its glass castle from shattering in full view of the world. They reveal an organization that knows it's in crisis, even if it can't admit that to its members. They show leadership that understands the old methods aren't working anymore but can't bring themselves to make the fundamental changes that would actually address the root problems. What's happening now isn't opening. It's resistance. It's crisis management. It's the beginning of the end of an era, not because they chose to change, but because they had no other choice. The Watchtower is changing not because they've seen the light, but because they're afraid of the darkness closing in. And for those of you watching who are still inside, I want you to understand something crucial. These changes validate everything you've been quietly questioning. If the policies were right before, they wouldn't need to change them now. If the organization really is directed by God, why does it keep needing to adjust course based on external pressure rather than internal conviction? If this is the truth, why does the truth keep changing to match what critics have been saying all along? You're not crazy for noticing the contradictions. You're not weak for feeling exhausted by the demands. You're not apostate for questioning whether an organization that spent decades destroying people's lives with harmful policies and then quietly changed those policies without apology or accountability might not actually be what it claims to be. The truth is that the changes happening right now prove that the organization has been wrong about fundamental policies for decades. And if they were that wrong about things that affected millions of lives, maybe, just maybe, they're wrong about their central claim too, the claim that they alone speak for God. Think about it. Research it. And whatever you decide, make sure it's your decision based on actual information, not a decision made for you based on fear and control. If this investigation resonated with you, if it helped you understand what's really happening behind the carefully crafted announcements and spiritual language, please share this video. There are people in your life who need to see this, who need to know they're not alone in their doubts, who need permission to think critically about an organization that has told them critical thinking is spiritual weakness. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into how high-control groups operate, how religious organizations use manipulation, and how people find their way out of systems designed to trap them. Your story matters. Your questions are valid, and you deserve answers that don't come wrapped in fear and control. Thank you for watching. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. And above all, stay true to yourself.